everyone, I'm Crystal Diff, Program Coordinator with History Services, and today I'm on location at Cedar Point Environmental Park in Inglewood to present the historic Cookie House to you. As you can see behind me, the Cookie House has a historical marker, but it doesn't have only one, it actually has two historic markers. It's one of the only structures within Charlotte County that has two designated historical markers for it. One at the original location and one here at the park where it was moved to in 2009. This building is one of the last surviving structures of the Bass Biological Laboratory that was here in Inglewood during the 30s and 40s. So let's go on inside and take a closer look and learn more about the history of the Cookie House. The Cookie House was the first and smallest log cabin of the many on site. It was originally part of a 10-acre research compound for the Bass Biological Laboratories, which was started by John Foster Bass Jr. The Cookie House was actually one of the first buildings that was built on site and served as the office and workshop for John Foster Bass Jr. himself. This stovewood construction building is very rare within the state of Florida and may be one of the only historic stovewood construction buildings in the entire state. John Bass Jr. was from Chicago, and this style of construction was much more familiar up there than it was here. But that's how he knew how to build, and those are the building styles that he brought with him. All of the logs in the building are local pine that he took from his property off of San Casa Boulevard. The logs were cut up into smaller pieces and laid up on top of each other with a mortar mix in between. The mortar mix actually used local beach sand to create it. The building itself is only 12 feet by 24 feet long and about 290 square feet in size. So why is it called the Cookie House if it was part of a scientific laboratory? Well, locals thought that it looked similar to cookies stacked up on top of each other. And it actually is very reminiscent of sugarloaf cookies that were popular at the time. Sugarloaf cookies were made in a similar way where you would have a round log of dough that you would slice into thinner cookies, and that is a similar way that they treated the pine logs when they were creating this building. Let's go take a closer look inside. So here we are inside of the historic Cookie House, and you can see that the stovewood construction is still visible from the inside. It's the same logs, and the walls are about 6 inches thick all around. This building was part of a 10-acre research compound that was off of New Point Comfort Road. And John Foster Bass Jr. came here from Chicago. He was actually willed some money so that he could start his own research facility. And he ended up in Inglewood because he was trying to find a place that had tropical weather, had temperate climate, so that they could do research all year round. And this was actually the first full-time research facility south of North Carolina. It was also one of the first co-ed research facilities, which was a very big deal at that time. This building was built in 1931, and as I said, it was the first building that was built on site. There were other stovewood construction buildings on the property that were erected over time, but this is the last surviving structure of the entire Bass Biological Laboratory facility. So how did John Bass get here from Chicago? Why Inglewood? Well, aside from the tropical weather that we had here, Lemon Bay and Charlotte Harbor were already so popular for their fishing. We were having tarpon tournaments since the 1800s. We had people like President Theodore Roosevelt who would come and fish in our waters, and it just kind of snowballed over time where more and more people started to hear about the mass amount of fish that we had in our waters here. And of course, fishing was a very big industry in this area. So it was a great place to house a marine research facility. You had open access to the water. He had access to Lemon Bay right off of Gottfried Creek, and he could also get into Charlotte Harbor waters or into the Gulf of Mexico. And they also had a lot of access to land. This area was pretty much undeveloped at that time, so they were able to do a lot of research on land as well as in the water. Over time, there were about a dozen other buildings that comprised the entire research facility. There was a private residence for John Bass and his wife Elsie. There was a water tower, a windmill, a boathouse, and also bunkhouses for scientists. They also had 3 different vessels for scientists to do their research. There is the 54-foot long 2-mast schooner named Virginia, the 25-foot launch, and the 12-foot launch. One of the great things about the Bass Biological Laboratory is all of the photos that they took over time. We have tons of photos of the insides of the structures, outside of the structures, property, all the expeditions that the scientists were on, things that they were catching and documenting at the time. So we can really get a glimpse into what life was actually like as they were living it in the 30s and 40s. You can see that I have a lot of items on the shelves and throughout the cookie house, but these are just props. But we're able to use those photos to recreate the scene. There are a lot of small things here and there that do surprise me that are still intact from the original structure, such as this paper towel holder and soap dispenser behind me, which were actually photographed in one of the original pictures from 1931. Since Bass Labs was open year-round and had a unique environment to explore, it attracted scientists from all over North America and Europe. It was also a starting place for many different scientists of many backgrounds. If you were in a university or college, you can get a recommendation to come and study here. But even if you did not have any school background, you could still come and research here if you would send a letter to John Bass and tell him why you needed to study here. So it really helped people of different backgrounds pursue the career that they wanted to. And John Bass understood that because his background did not involve any biology or science. So he was very open to people of all walks of life. It was $1 a day to research here and use the lab, and $2 a day if you wanted to do research but also stay and board at the Bass Biological Lab facility. There were about 100 scientists that did research here. John Bass kept a lot of records and notated everybody that came in and out of the facility. Everyone had to write a letter to try to explain what their research was before they showed up. And they also had to submit their research to John Bass before they left. There was one other unique thing that John Bass had all of the scientists do, and that was write a poem. Now, the poems for me really helped to get a better glimpse of what their lives were on a daily basis and the different tasks that they had to complete and how hard it was to live out here during that time. The research itself would give you that very professional background on what they were recording at that time. But these poems really gave you a more human sense to what was going on here. It would give you an idea of how many days that they sat out on a boat waiting for that one nocturnal shark to pop up. It would tell you about all of the mosquitoes that were here and how hot it was. Things that you would not see in a scientific research paper. But they did work very hard, and over time they recorded 470 different marine and terrestrial creatures. But not only did they work very hard, they also played very hard as well. There were weddings recorded at the site. There were also family picnics, and they would record what they had for those picnics. They would dress up for Halloween in silly costumes. So this was very much a place of community as well as professional scientific research that was really pushing forward for information that was world-renowned. And often these scientists were discovering things for the very first time that nobody else had seen before. Aside from capturing and documenting different flora and fauna, they actually were able to keep some of the animals alive right on site at the laboratory. They built different containment areas and habitats so that they could document the behavioral science of different animals, such as the life cycle of ducks. Or they were able to capture live fish and actually bring them back in holding tanks here, and they actually had a generator to give them electricity to help power pumps, air pumps, to keep these fish alive. Now, with all of the fish and different animals that they were able to capture here, they were able to supply other laboratory facilities with specimens. If schools needed frogs for dissection, you could purchase those from the Zoological Research Supply Company, which was a subsidiary of the Bass Biological Labs. Here you can see that we actually have a purchase order and letterhead from that research supply facility. This was also a way that they were able to gain more revenue for their site. They were catching so many sharks with the natural estuaries that we have around here that they even created another company called Genuine Shark Products. Now this one was more for the general public, where they would sell shark liver oil, shark teeth jewelry, and even shark skin. Shark skin was actually used kind of like sandpaper. If you touched a shark from nose to tail, it's very smooth. But if you touched a shark from tail to nose, it's very rough. So you could actually use that as sandpaper. Most of the photos that we have from the Bass Laboratory were actually taken by John's assistant, Donald Zinn. Now, Donald Zinn came to John Bass without any degree, but as he worked here, he slowly built himself up with more knowledge and more experience in the field. He actually ended up going to Yale University and graduating in 1942. Where he earned his PhD. Some of the more noteworthy scientists that passed through the Bass Labs were John Davis Jr. and Archie Carr, who were really well known as scientific leaders here in Inglewood. Frank Blanchard, who was a herpetologist who discovered the Florida king snake while doing research here. Willis Gersh, who was one of the top arachnologists at the time, and he actually helped out in a very popular story called Charlotte's Web. The author E.B. White contacted Mr. Gersh to get more information on what kind of spider that Charlotte would be. And he contacted him back and let him know all about Charlotte, how Charlotte was a common barn spider, and that the scientific name was Araneus cavaticus. Charlotte's name is actually influenced by this information, and her full name in the story is Charlotte A. cavatica. Her children's names are also derivative of that scientific term, such as Arania. Olga Hartman was another who found 13 different bristle worms. The laboratory stayed open until 1944. Unfortunately, John Foster Bass Jr. passed away in 1939 very suddenly at the young age of 42. His wife and colleagues tried to continue the Bass Labs without him, but with World War II rationing and other complications, they had to shut their doors on the facility. It did run for 13 years. All of the research, documentation, and photographs that we have to put the pieces of this puzzle together are housed at the Mote Marine Laboratory and Archives. Most of these are available online for you to view. I hope you enjoyed your tour here of the historic Cookie House.